fortunate to have her here today to share her thoughts on interdisciplinary thinking and why it is the only way we will solve the great challenges of the 21st century. I give you my former teacher, my role model, and my longtime friend, Betsy Hoffman.
Thank you, Kim. What a wonderful introduction. I want to just say at the outset that this will use a lot of examples from Iowa State because that's my most familiar situation right now, but I'm going to try to give it to you in a much broader context. So, first of all, what I'm going to talk about is how partnerships are the key to solve global problems. So people working together are more likely to succeed. Families, communities, colleges, and countries. And I'm going to talk from the perspective of a modern land-grant university because that's what I'm familiar with, and many of you, if you go to graduate school, will end up at a land-grant university or something similar to a land-grant university. And at a modern land-grant university, almost all the work that goes on is interdisciplinary. There's a few people who do sort of standard standalone work, but the vast majority of the work is interdisciplinary. And if you think about the research grants that we get, we have almost $400 million a year in sponsored funding. It's almost all interdisciplinary. So in the last year, we've gotten 4 grants over $20 million apiece, all of which not only involve multiple disciplines within the university, but partnerships with other universities and colleges, with community colleges, with school districts, to bring young people into the scientific workforce. And in fact, the National Science Foundation now requires that in order to get a major National Science Foundation grant, you have to not only propose a broad scientific agenda, but you have to do something called broader impacts, which is to show how your work can be applied either to business and industry or to the preparation of the scientific workforce of the future. And so we partner with colleges like Whittier in the state of Iowa, for instance, Grinnell, Luther, St. Olaf College, which is just north of the border where my husband went to school. We partner with our liberal arts colleges as well as with community colleges and high schools and even grade schools. So the researchers may be faculty in different departments or colleges who have found it beneficial to work together, or it may be formal arrangements or joint appointments in different departments or memoranda of understanding that can be international in scope. Again, not only do we have partnerships with universities across the country, we have partnerships with universities and NGOs all across the world. So when we think about the grand challenges of the 21st century, I like to say to students, look ahead to 2050. I graduated from college in 1968, and in 2050, those of you who are in college today will be at about the same age as I am today. And so your careers will really span the period from now until 2050. And when I think about what are the great challenges that we have to meet in the next 4 decades to ensure that there's a high quality of life for the 9 billion or more people we expect to be on this planet by 2050. So just here's a non-exhaustive list of the grand challenges of the 21st century: renewable, non-polluting energy, abundant clean water, access to modern health care, sustainable agriculture and manufacturing, safe roads and bridges, adequate preparation for and protection from natural and man-made disasters. We could add health. We could add bringing down the rate of population growth. There's a whole host of these grand challenges that the national academies have put forward, that the National Institutes of Health have put forward, the National Research Council, the National Science Foundation have all put forward their lists of grand challenges of the 21st century, and these are just a few of them. So as we prepare to face these grand challenges, we need to create a pathway to human progress, and it requires a combination of technical expertise and social ingenuity to collaborate locally and globally with full appreciation of cultural ideas, the cultural values and priorities. So we can't just impose what Americans think about how to do things on the rest of the world. We have to think about where they start from, what their values are, and help them to develop within their own system and try to do it in a more sustainable way than we have done it here in the West. It takes determination and vision, practical engineering, pragmatic solutions, but also education, hard work, and relationships and commitment across the globe. So I thought I'd give you a few examples of some things we're doing at Iowa State, and then try to branch out a bit to talk about, if you go to graduate school, what you can expect to be looking at, both from a disciplinary perspective and an interdisciplinary perspective. So I'm going to talk about sort of 4 big initiatives we have at Iowa State. One is something we call the Bioeconomy Institute. And part of the Bioeconomy Institute is the BioCentury Research Farm. It's really trying to understand what will the farm of the future look like, combining food production and renewable energy, what we call the One Health Initiative. Almost all the new diseases today are zoonotic diseases, meaning they move from animals to humans. And so having a College of Veterinary Medicine means that, and we partner then with health sciences centers at the University of Iowa and the University of Nebraska, because we're sort of halfway between the two, and also the University of Minnesota, which is about the same distance as the University of Iowa and the University of Nebraska. And we're starting to partner with the University of Kansas as well. So we're sort of looking at the 4 corners of medical schools that surround us. We have one of the best veterinary colleges in the country. We certainly have one of the best animal and plant science programs in the world, and bringing together all of those disciplines to address the question of the intersection of plant, animal, and human health. And then that leads to feeding the world. So let's start with the grand challenge of energy. The world will continue to depend on fossil fuels for a considerable amount of time, particularly the increasing demand in China. Some of you may have read about the building of new ports on the West Coast to send coal from Wyoming and the Great Basin to China. It's very controversial, but there's already one in Vancouver. There's a lot of controversy now about whether we should build one in Bellingham, Washington, for example. I don't think China, India, and the emerging economies are not going to stop burning fossil fuels, even if we start to move off fossil fuels, which I don't see happening in the near future either. So global use of petroleum products is projected to rise from 85.7 million barrels a day in 2008 to 112.2 million barrels a day in 2035, with a huge demand for transportation for fuel. The fastest growing energy resources, however, are renewable: solar power, wind power, hydroelectric power, biorenewables. And about 10% of energy supplied is by renewables, projected to grow to about 14% by 2036, but that still leaves a lot of room for petroleum products. So let me talk about the Bioeconomy Institute and the BioCentury Research Farm. So one of the big questions in agriculture today is how to produce food, fuel, and animal products right on the farm, because of the cost to transport is so high. So we are in the process of building a cellulosic ethanol plant. Let me decompose that a little bit. So this is a plant that will produce ethanol not from corn, which is how ethanol is produced today, but from the byproducts of production, from corn stalks that tend to get left in the field, from corn cobs, from this, as we increase the yield on corn to over 200 bushels an acre, which is what we're talking about today, the amount of stuff that gets left on the land is so large that even with no-till agriculture, it's too much to process to plow under. And so we're going to be collecting this leftover stuff from the production of corn and soybeans and producing it as cellulosic ethanol. This plant is projected to use all of the byproducts of corn and soybean production for a 50-mile radius. And just think of the cost of transporting this very bulky stuff from a 50-mile radius to one plant. So one of the things we're looking at is how can every farm be a producer of ethanol, and how to do it in a way that minimizes the production of CO2 in the production of ethanol. Well, in order to do this, just think about the number of different specialists it takes to study this question. Obviously, you need agronomists to develop new crops and to figure out how to produce corn or soybeans that has more other stuff that you can produce as many bushels of corn and soybeans as well as much additional cellulose to burn as fuel or to process into ethanol. You need water quality experts to ensure that you don't degrade the water at the same time that you produce ethanol. And then engineers to design technology to use waste carbon products to develop products that can be converted to replacements for petroleum. Just to name a few. We also have economists to understand and logistics specialists to understand the costs and benefits of different ways of producing cellulosic ethanol. And logistics, which has become a hot new topic, if you've listened to a few commercials recently, it's all about logistics. How do you transport things in an efficient manner at the lowest possible cost to bring them from the farm to the production? And doing it on the farm reduces those transportation costs, reduces those logistics costs. So that brings us to the BioCentury Research Farm. So what we're looking at is what we call the farm of probably the 22nd century, the farm of the middle of the 21st century, that will grow food crops, it will grow cellulosic crops, it will convert biomass that is not used for food into bio-renewable energy. And one of the things that we're looking at is, up until now, ethanol has been produced the way the alcohol you drink is produced, through fermentation. But we're looking at a different process, again, with a lot of engineers involved, a lot of agronomists involved, a lot of economists involved, which is called fast pyrolysis, and chemists involved, where you literally heat the waste products to a very high heat and convert it, which separates it into a crackable carbon product that looks and cracks like oil. So that means that oil companies know what to do with it. Oil companies don't know what to do with traditional ethanol that is produced by the way that the alcohol you drink is produced. But a crackable petroleum product, carbon product, can be used just like petroleum products by current oil companies. And so they're very interested in the development of this new kind of bio-oil. And the really interesting thing about it is the byproduct of this bio-oil is something called biochar, which is the best natural fertilizer in the entire world. It's basically very fine charcoal that creates incredibly fertile soil. So it allows you to also substitute the byproduct of a biological process for petroleum-based, nitrogen-based fertilizers that are currently used on soil. So lots of opportunities, but it takes a wide range of people working together across disciplines to make this happen. We know we can do it. We can do it in small quantities right now. The question is, how quickly can we scale it up so that you not only get the oil products and you get it not from something that's competing with food, but something that is a waste product, and you get a very high quality fertilizer from a biological product at the same time. And then you also want to combine animal production with food production because there's an increasing demand for protein around the world. And so learning how to produce animal products as inexpensively as possible and use their waste on the farm as well. So trying to reduce the use of chemicals, of petroleum-based and nitrogen-based chemicals to the extent possible. Another grand challenge is food and water. Society needs secure food and clean water. About 70 rivers in the world are closing or not reaching their deltas due to overuse. So they're literally drying up before they get to the ocean. The Colorado River is barely a trickle by the time it gets to the Gulf of Mexico, for example. About 800 million people are undernourished, and 852 million people are chronically hungry due to extreme poverty. Up to 2 billion people lack food security due to poverty. 6 million children die of hunger every year, or about 17,000 every day. It's really hard for those of us in the United States who don't face hunger, don't see hunger, to imagine the degree of hunger around the world. And by 2025, we could face food scarcity and losses largely due to lack of water. At the same time, you have flooding in other places. So you look at Thailand is now virtually underwater. Much of Bangladesh is underwater. At the same time, you have increasing droughts in other parts of the world. Water covers 70.9% of the surface of the planet, but it's vital for all forms of life. People drink fresh water, but that's only 2.5% of the Earth's water. And 2/3 of that is frozen, mostly in the Antarctic ice sheet, which, by the way, I've actually been to Antarctica, and you don't realize the vastness of it until you go there. And the fact that the South Pole is at 10,000 feet, 10,000 feet of ice below you at the South Pole. And that's this humongous ice sheet that covers all of Antarctica, and that's a huge proportion of the Earth's fresh water. And agriculture uses 70% of the fresh water. Poor water quality and bad sanitation kill 5 million people a year. The World Health Organization estimates that safe water could end 1.4 million child deaths a year due to diarrhea. And about 40% of the world's population can't dispose of its own waste safely. If you look at the history of mortality decline in the West, we think of modern medicine. modern medicine had absolutely nothing to do with the decline in mortality in the West. It was all sanitation and nutrition, because most of the mortality was children under 5, and most of the mortality was due to childhood diarrhea and complications. So if you had diarrhea all the time, you were going to die of measles or chickenpox or scarlet fever, diseases that today our children are vaccinated for, and those of us who are a little older got them and recovered from them because we were healthy and we had good sanitation. But if you go to Africa today, you see children who are malnourished, children who suffer from the kinds of diseases that Westerners suffered from 2 centuries ago. And simply, many places in Africa, they don't need modern equipment. What they need is clean, safe water. They need to understand nutrition for children. So when children are weaned, they're weaned to unsafe food because the water is not safe, and so they're mixing the food with unsafe water. They get childhood diarrhea, and they continue to die in large numbers or to be malnourished in large numbers. And so education of parents in the transition from breast milk to food, education in how to make unsanitary food sanitary, is absolutely essential to future economic development in the poorest parts of the world. So how do you feed the world? Again, you need a group of people all working together. You need agronomists, you need people who look at distribution, pest control, help farmers learn technology, and increasing protein availability across the world. Just very, very small changes that we take for granted in the United States make a huge difference. But again, it's not just one, it's in fact not even doctors. It's agronomists, it's nutritionists, it's public health workers, and it's people who go and talk to the individuals in the community and get them to then teach their neighbors. Because really, if we in the West bring our knowledge, it's really, what we know is not what they need, really. So let me ask you a question. What do you think is the first piece of modern equipment that a Ugandan farmer will purchase if they have a little bit of money? Anybody want to try? A cell phone. A cell phone. Why? Because they want to be able, as soon as their crop is ready to be marketed, they want to be able to call their distributors. So they don't keep their phones on all the time. It's much too expensive. And they don't even charge them at home because they have no electricity. So the towns have charging stations where you can go and charge your cell phone, and you go to the town in the middle of the day, almost any day, there'll be people standing around charging their cell phones. One member of the family might be shopping or getting water because they still have to cart water long distances, and somebody will be charging the cell phone because the cell phone is the lifeline to their distribution, to their ability to sell their bananas or their hogs or their cassava root or whatever it is they're producing that's more than their families can eat. So this is a picture on the left is what the latrine looked like before it was rebuilt, and on the right is what a modern, as it were, latrine in Kamuli village looks like. Another grand challenge is disease. 40 million people are living with HIV/AIDS, with 3 million deaths in 2004. There's been a dramatic decline in deaths due to HIV in Africa just by one, education, and 2, getting retroviral drugs to the people across Africa. So this is actually a case where modern medicine is making a difference. But for example, when I was in Uganda, Uganda actually has one of the lowest rates of HIV infection in all of Africa. About 8% of adults are infected in Uganda as compared to 40% of adults in Botswana. And everywhere you go in Uganda, there are huge posters about safe sex. So billboards all over the country touting safe sex. So that the president of Uganda has taken it upon himself to take charge of this huge problem and educate the people of this country with billboards and pictures and radio ads, and the change has been extraordinary. So now let's turn to the issue of this sort of One Health. A few years ago, the American Medical Association and the American Veterinary Association got together and formed the One Health Commission. So when you think about the recent epidemics, they have all been diseases that are transmitted either from humans. So in the case of H1N1, it was a human-pig-bird disease. It took the combination of humans, pigs, and birds, the genetic combination of diseases of all 3 to create the scourge of H1N1 that probably many of you actually got sick from a year or 2 ago. And so the mission is really to create a worldwide organization that will combine the study of human health and animal health. And it's to develop a strategy for public health and an agenda compatible with that. And it actually happens to be located, again, at Iowa State in our research park. And if you think about, again, I was talking about all the medical centers that surround us, the veterinary centers, the animal and plant research. All of that has to come together in order to really achieve better human health. And it's not just medicine, it's also behavioral. In fact, a great deal of human health today is behavioral. What do we eat? How do we exercise? How much sleep do we get? Do we practice safe sex? All of those things are behavioral. And we can have all the modern medicine in the world, washing your hands. In fact, during the H1N1 epidemic a year and a half ago, I'm sure it happened here at Whittier, it certainly happened at my institution. Every washroom in the entire university has posters about washing your hands. In fact, I saw some in your buildings as well. And it turns out that washing your hands is probably the most important way to prevent the spread of the flu. Simple, but it takes a behavioral change for everybody to wash their hands all the time. Very simple. A heart disease can be prevented by diet, exercise. Now, a big part of it is genetic, but you can do a lot to improve your genetic odds by exercise, diet, and sleep. And we all know that lung cancer, the incidence of lung cancer is directly related to the incidence of smoking. So all that is behavioral. So let me just go on. So I just want to go on now to the sort of those of you who might go to graduate school. So if you want to be part of the coolest, newest research that's going on in the world today, you're going to end up as part of an interdisciplinary team. You'll want to get a PhD in a subject area, so you get a very, very deep understanding of the techniques, the way of thinking, the kind of research, but you want to very quickly get into a much larger research project, because if you stick to a very narrow way of thinking, you're probably not going to ever get involved in looking at these grand challenges of the 21st century. So there's a lot of universities now that offer interdisciplinary degrees where you study one thing but you do something else at the same time. Or if you're in biology today, for example, nobody studies biology. You study evolutionary biology. You study molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. You study toxicology. There's a wide range of things that you study, but rarely do you get a degree in biology. Now you can still get a degree in economics, although at Caltech it was social science. Most of us went into economics, but some went into political science and psychology and I guess history now, if you go into history. And yet Caltech is still ranked one of the top 20 economics PhD programs in the country, even though you don't get a PhD in economics, you get a PhD in social science. And that was an extraordinarily valuable experience for me and for many, many of the students who went through the program. And here's just a sample of institutions where you can actually get interdisciplinary degrees, where you get the focus of a dissertation, where you get the focus of learning a subject, but you really get to participate in a wide variety of disciplines. So I talked a little bit about biology. So if you go to graduate school and become a researcher, what will the world look like for you? It's interdisciplinary. You may find a silo. You may find a discipline at a small college, but if you go to a big university, you're going to be working in very big research laboratories. And it's not necessary for any individual to know all the different disciplines. What's incredibly valuable is if you work in one of these big research groups, you probably get together once a week, and everybody shares their findings from the previous week, and you talk about how everything works together, and then you move on. And I actually got turned on to this particular way of doing research as an undergraduate. I was recruited to work on an interdisciplinary team that was studying the demographic transition. And I was recruited because I read Italian. And the Italian statistics were some of the best in the world. It turns out that with the unification of Italy, the Italians pressured their government to improve the sewage system and the water distribution system because they wanted their children to be healthy enough to migrate to America. And what ensued was an incredibly rapid decline in mortality. At the same time, they set up the best statistical data collection system in the world at the time. And so you could go into their data and you could find out what every person in the country died of, how old they were, where they lived, and you can really trace this decline in mortality. And the biggest factor for the decline in mortality was the decline in childhood diarrhea. And then the next was measles, childhood diseases, which by epidemiological standards are linked to being less healthy because of childhood diarrhea. And so Italy, as most Western countries, went from a situation where 50% of the children who were born didn't survive past age 5 to the point where 95 to 99% of the children who were born survive past age 5. And that is a major determinant of the decline in mortality. And it turns out that as parents can assure themselves that their children will survive, not surprisingly, they have fewer children. And so a lot of people say, well, I'm really terrified to see mortality decline in Africa because we're going to have an explosion of population. The problem we have now is that mortality has declined a little bit, but there's still a lot of malnutrition, there's still a lot of childhood death before age 5, and parents still cannot be sure that their children will survive. And so making the kinds of investments in children that we see today in all of you and that our parents made in us happens because you believe that your children are going to survive. It's not worth investing in your children if you don't think they're going to survive. It's a paradox. Declining mortality and ensuring that children are going to survive actually leads over time to decisions to have fewer children. And so ultimately, if we think about the population explosion we're going through, ultimately it is feeding the world, providing safe water, providing sanitation particularly for children under 5, that will eventually lead to stabilization of population. So again, you think about bringing together a wide variety of people to address the population problem. So I'll just close by talking again about the Caltech experience that Paul and Kim and I experienced, and also at Purdue, where interdisciplinary work was the norm and the expectation. And it's been my life has been spent doing interdisciplinary work. And really, when I see what's happening at big universities today, when I see what's happening with people who are really addressing the grand challenges of the 21st century, it is all interdisciplinary. So with that, I'll stop and take questions. Thank you.
Sure, Professor Hoffman would be willing to take questions from you for a while. Please.
Paul.
The program of research and education that you're describing is probably very expensive. Can you say something about the future of financing universities and whether we have to think of alternatives outside the universities to make this work?
Well, that's a really interesting question. It used to be that a lot of research was done in industrial laboratories. Bell Labs, for example.
Broken up by U.S. government action. Really?
Yeah. It's become too expensive. I know you still have a research group at Intel, but it's becoming more and more difficult to maintain industrial research groups. I think what we're going to see is much more partnership. What I didn't talk about, which I could have added to all this conversation, all of these projects that I talked about have industrial partners. So the BioCentury Research Farm is partially funded by ConocoPhillips, for example. A $22 million grant from ConocoPhillips, a $20 million grant from the National Science Foundation, several grants in that range from the USDA. All come together, and lots of small biorenewables companies in the state of Iowa are investing in this research. So the partnerships, the companies see the outcome of this research as valuable to them, and so they're investing in it. But unlike the period of a generation ago, when companies could have very large research labs, I think you're going to see more partnerships between universities and among universities, the federal government, the state government, and because the state government still invests pretty substantially in Iowa State University, and in the University of California, despite all the budget cuts that have happened, the state is still a big supporter of the University of California, and companies. Now that makes it really challenging because you have to make sure that academic freedom is preserved, you have to make sure that you're not selling your soul, as it were, to the company that's supporting your research. But you're right, this is very expensive. Research is very expensive. And it also is almost a pure public good because in many cases, the benefits of research don't accrue to those who invest in it. Now we're trying to another thing that has to happen is to speed up the process of bringing things to market. So we put forward a strategic plan that really we talk about it as the agriculture or engineering counterpart to bench to bedside in medicine, of trying to speed up the process of bringing new ideas, designing new technologies and bringing them to market so that the partnerships with industry, so it's valuable to industrial partners to invest in the research. But there's no question this is expensive. And
I'm thinking of things like the talk about cutting budgets in the U.S. at all levels of government, and wondering how science research will fare in that environment.
I'm very worried about the U.S.'s place in the world in scientific research because China is investing billions and billions of dollars in scientific research. India is investing billions and billions of dollars in scientific research, and we are disinvesting in scientific research. And the fact is scientific research is expensive. Yes?
This is the kind of disciplinary question, too, that ties in with that. Like, I've noticed tremendous interdisciplinarity here between the social sciences and the sciences. Where do you see the role of the humanities in all of this?
So I talked a little bit about culture, and I should have probably expounded a bit on culture. Just to give you an example, when we went to Uganda, you could see the culture of Central Africa pervading everything that happened. So we opened up a new well, and there was singing and dancing and speeches by public officials, and the well was draped in crepe paper, and there was just, you could just see so much of the culture of the community surrounding the drilling of a new well. I think the humanities are absolutely central, and the respect for the culture, the music, the dance, the art of the community in which you work is extremely important as well.
I suppose languages, too, as well.
Language as well, although for good or bad, a lot of languages are dying. Yeah.
I want to push Wendy's question a little more in a specific way.
Sure.
As we think about what you were talking about with the farm, for example, I can't help as an historian to think about what has happened to agriculture and the agrana business, essentially, and yet a concern about culture in rural communities. How do we balance, and here's where a culture perspective would lend it, to this making a farm the center of this kind of production with petroleum kinds of byproducts, as well as the traditional kinds of crops that farms have produced. Clearly makes it beyond the American example of a family farm.
I think it's the only way to save the family farm, frankly. I think the
That
only
is
way.
the question about costs as well. I don't expect you to answer it, but how would we bring in groups to help answer that?
Well, we actually have sociologists involved in the Bioeconomy Institute, economists, psychologists. We have the College of Design is involved in the design of this farm. I really think that if we're successful in creating the BioCentury Research Farm, it's probably the only way to save the family farm in America, because the fact is that farming is becoming increasingly industrial, increasingly mechanized, and right now we've moved way in the direction of monocultural, where animal farms are separate from crop production. But what we found in the economic crisis of the 2007 to 2009 period, it was the diversified farms that did the best, because when grain prices went down, you fed the grain to the hogs, and because hog production was more profitable than grain production, and then when grain prices go up, you may produce more grain, but the hogs produce fertilizer. It cuts down on the fertilizer cost, which is extremely expensive. And so, if we can also produce biorenewable energy products or biorenewable chemicals on the farm as well, we really turn the family farm into something. It's something different. But right now, if you drive around Iowa, I mean, there are towns that are increasingly deserted because the land is owned by somebody in New York, and it's farmed on a rental basis. The kids come and they study at Iowa State, and they don't necessarily go back to the farm. But this is one. I mean, I don't know if it's going to save the family farm, but it's at least has the potential to save the family farm. Yes.
Maybe I can tie in with that.
Excuse me?
Maybe I can tie in with that since we're all talking about farms, I guess small farmers. What happens when you're partnering with these large businesses that are donating to the research? And I mean, problems with patenting the seeds and the control that they get over, like with soybeans right now, that these farmers can't afford to pay these rates for the seeds, and how that is all controlled. I mean, how do you protect, I guess, society at large from the business of it
How
and
do you
balancing the two?
protect? Well, how to protect society at large from the business. I mean, one of the things, another thing we have is a sustainable agriculture program. It's called the Leopold Center after Waldo Leopold, who was one of the original environmentalists and an Iowan. And there's actually a growing resurgence of family farms, of small agriculture, and resurgence of the farmers market. We passed the farmers market coming in today. I think you're seeing agribusiness working side by side and with farmers who are producing for local markets. One of the things we do is we have a local foods program. So our food service tries to the extent possible to buy local foods. There's no way we're going to stop Monsanto from patenting its seeds. We do work with Monsanto to develop better seeds, a wider variety of seeds, drought-resistant seeds, seeds that use less fertilizer. But there's no way you can stop Monsanto from selling its seeds, and frankly from patenting for a period of time the germplasm in their seeds. We did sue Monsanto. won a judgment against them for stealing our germplasm. Yeah.
What can you say about the attitudes of different academic departments as far as multidisciplinary work goes? I have a sense that it's still looked down upon any academic interdisciplinary work that's done, no matter how rigorous and good it is. I still think you have these journals who
So we have a force to specialize. The world is asking all of these disciplines to specialize even further. So how does that work with the interdisciplinary?
So these are clearly challenges that we all face. One of the things that's driving the interdisciplinarity is that the major funding agencies are requiring partnerships and interdisciplinary work. So if you want to get a big NIH grant or a National Science Foundation grant or a Department of Energy grant today, you have to focus, and you want it to be more than just enough to keep your laboratory alive, you have to partner. We actually got we have a national laboratory on our campus, the Ames Laboratory, and the Ames Laboratory got turned down for some big DOE grants a couple of years ago because they weren't partnering with other national laboratories and other universities. So what's happening is the funding agencies are forcing, and the industrial partners are forcing faculty or departments to change the way that they view research. And also, so I'm the provost. I ultimately am the one who recommends whether someone gets tenure. And if someone is turned down for tenure by their department, it comes to me. And I actually have, on occasion, overturned negative tenure decisions because I believed that the department was not paying attention to the interdisciplinary work of the faculty member. And everybody at Iowa State knows this. I mean, they know not to do that because I kind of know what all the disciplines are doing. I know what all the interdisciplinary work is because I've been at this a long time. And part of it is just talking about it. Part of it is giving talks like this where you really talk about addressing the things that people care about, the things that are going to affect our lives. And some people will always do very specialized research. And if they do it well, great. They're probably not going to have as much fun as those who work in large research teams. Yeah.
I'm still hung up back on the idea of the size of the farms. It strikes me as you talk about these various technologies that different ones of them will probably be appropriate to different scales of operation.
Absolutely.
And does that suggest maybe a resurgent place for agricultural co-ops within our productive system?
Sure.
I know my grandfather belonged to a walnut co-op.
But we still have co-ops
For
all over the state of Iowa. We still have
But
co-ops
I'm
all over
wondering
the state of Iowa.
about, for application of these technologies, that where you're having the process of converting the biomass to ethanol, would that be a collection of farms that would have an investment in that collectively, or something like that?
So the plant I talked about at the very beginning is about 10 miles east of, it's going to be built about 10 miles east of Ames.
Yeah.
And it's literally going to collect all the leftover agricultural waste for about a 50-mile radius. So to some extent, you know, these large facilities probably will be cooperatives. But what we're looking at is, can you scale it down to the family farm? Because first of all, that reduces the cost of transporting all this high bulk material. It also preserves the ability of individual farm families or groups of families. So my husband's family still farms near Charles City, Iowa, which is in the northwest part of Iowa. And it's multi-generational. It's about a 1,000-acre farm, to use Jane Smiley's analogy. And it's a multi-generational farm where the children have their own houses in various places around, but they all come together to plant and harvest and cultivate the land and produce the hog. They have a hog facility.
How viable is that as fertility goes down?
Well, one of the things biochar will do and animal waste does is to improve the fertility of the soil.
No, of the people.
The people.
Oh, the fertility, I'm sorry.
Spoken like somebody who does demography.
Well, U.S. fertility is pretty much stabilized at around 2 children per household. I think that's always going to be an issue, and we need to renew, and we need to recruit more people to farming. I think that's happening as well with small-scale farming. But what's really interesting, so think about a Midwestern farm, which is thousands of acres, and a Kamuli, Uganda farm, which is going to be 2 or 3 hectares, completely done with hand tools, and yet highly productive if worked very carefully, and if they use animal waste on the farm, and if they produce biochar, and they're beginning to start producing oil and byproducts as well, but using completely hand tools. So the other thing that they might buy is a bicycle. So a bicycle, because then you can get to water more quickly, you can get to town to recharge your cell phone more quickly, your children can go to school. Oh, and also then they'll pay for their children to go to school. But the last thing they're going to do is get running water or flush toilets or any of the things that we consider we couldn't live without. They don't. That's sort of the last thing in the world that they would think of doing. They're gonna buy a cell phone, a bicycle, maybe a motorbike. They can afford the petrol, and send their children to school.